Hey folks, welcome back to the Shuffle Squad YouTube channel. My name is Cyrus Davis, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my, if not my top pick for Brazil currently. We're still a couple weeks out, but this is what I've been testing with. Some of you may know I played a very similar Giratina list to Toronto Regionals, and went 5-3-1 for 20 points. I did hit Henry Brand, James Cox, and Andre Scuball in that day one, so it was a tough day one. But I think the deck performed very well. I ended up getting knocked out of day two by someone playing Miraidon, where I drew pretty rough my game two, and then my game three. Never saw a Colress until my very last turn. So I just was way too far behind at that point. But yeah, I think the deck is very strong, and I think it's even stronger going to Paradox Rift meta. I played Cross Switchers at Toronto. Now I have Counter Catcher in the deck. Counter Catcher is an incredibly strong addition to the deck. Cross Switcher being like a very inconsistent card that normally you're not going to pull off more than once per game, almost ever. And other than that one usage, if that one usage is even worth it, it's just a dead card, right? So, but I still felt like it was worth it. It still was really strong anytime I got to use it at Toronto. And the fact that we can now just cut that and play Counter Catcher, which is a way more consistent card that you can pull off multiple times per game. Whether that be even just like an early game random Counter Catcher to try to buy more time, buy you a turn, by trapping something in the active because you have a slower start, bring up like a Flaffy against Miraidon, bringing up a random Greninja against Guardy to force them to have the energy attachment for it. There are a lot of like weird uses for like random gusts throughout the game. Normally you're going to want to save them for if you think that you're going to be behind in the late game. You're going to want to save them for a turn where you can like Roxanne or Iono and play Path on the same turn, stuff like that. That's where the card really shines. But being able to Gust and Roxanne and Path all on the same turn, relatively consistently near the end of the game, while using something like Star Requiem to take a big knockout, it makes it so much more consistent to be able to like take a 4-prize turn or 4-prize 2 turns with one Giratina, which ultimately is what makes Giratina really, really strong. That potential to survive, to take an auto knockout on something and survive a hit is what makes Giratina so much better than something like Lost Box, especially in this format. Now that we have to worry about things like Jirachi and Iron Hands, Giratina becomes a much more reliable answer to those cards because your deck isn't really that reliant on Sableye to win games. Sableye is great, but it's not the core of the deck. Although you will use Sableye most games, of course. Now, everything else about the list is relatively standard. We have typical 3-3 Giratina line, 2 Sableye, only 1 Cramorant, 1 Greninja, 1 Manaphy. I'm playing just 2 Water Energy. This is enough that we'll pretty much, in Game 1, always see a Water Energy come into a public zone at some point. That means that our opponent has to respect that we play the Greninja and we play Water Energy, so they have to bench the Manaphy, which can be a nice, easy prize for us to take with our Sableye at some point. So basically just like having that threat and pressure of having Water Energy in our deck is why we play the 2. I've even seen some lists last format with only 1. I think you might as well just play 2. That way you actually do have the ability to use Greninja. I only played 2 Water at Toronto, and I didn't end up being able to attack with Greninja quite a few times. So even with 2, it's still very possible. A lot of the time you will need to use 2 Mirage Gate on the same turn in order to pull that off. But that's typically not that big of a deal because you can put 3 energy on the Greninja with Mirage Gates, and then you can set up 1 energy on a Tina to set it up for Star Requiem on a following turn without needing to Mirage Gate to it, since Star Requiem is an only 2 attachment attack. In this deck, you don't mind going for the double Mirage Gate plays because you can usually get use out of the extra energy that you have to put into play right away. Whether that be retreating, or setting up for Star Requiem, or putting the energy on Sableye, you can relatively easily put that extra energy from the Mirage Gate somewhere that is actually going to be useful right away. Even putting on like a Giratina VSTAR is a pretty safe spot to put it. You know, in other Lost Zone decks, a lot of the time the extra energy that you commit somewhere will end up getting bossed and discarded that way. But with a deck like this, you can throw it on like a Giratina VSTAR, and it's usually pretty safe that energy is going to remain in play until your next turn, because it's not easy to not get a Giratina VSTAR, especially if you're using things like Roxanne and Path, and it's sitting on the bench, so your opponent also needs to boss it. We're going the 2 Roxanne, 1 Iono split. I don't mind the 2 Iono, 1 Roxanne for more early game consistency. However, I think that Roxanne generally is a way more consistent late game. This deck can really come back from behind. You can come back from like a 4 prize deficit if you hit the right pieces near the end of the game. It's just being able to consistently Roxanne is so much better than being able to Iono later. Because Iono is obviously, by the time that you want to be using Iono, is a terrible draw card. 1's nice because there are like going like draw 4 and put your opponent to 4 when you're both at like when you've both taken about 2 prize cards is a lot of the time is nice for a mid-game disruption. If you don't need to Colress that turn, maybe you had a really strong start and already have 10 Lost Zone, or maybe you just don't have a Colress and you need to draw some cards. However, for the majority of the game, I'd say that after the first couple turns, because your opponent's probably going to take a Giratina knockout as one of their first couple knockouts, especially if you go for something like an Abyss Seeking early, Roxanne is usually going to be live for the majority of the game, because you are trying to tank hits later on with Giratina. So you go into 3 prizes, Roxanne, take a knockout with Giratina, and Roxanne's still likely going to be live for a couple more turns still, because your opponent often won't take a knockout on the Giratina that turn. Whereas like a deck like Lost Box, when your opponent goes down to 3 prize cards, that means they have at most 3 turns left, because you're gonna have 1 prize but 1 active. They're just gonna go knockout, knockout, knockout. But a deck like this, you can survive a hit with Giratina. You can even bring up another Giratina and survive another hit with that. So you could be at 6 prizes while your opponent's at 3 and have like a solid 5 more turns where you have opportunities to use Roxanne, and it's just like the best draw supporter in the game basically at that point. You shuffle draw 6, your opponent shuffle draws 2. That draw support doesn't get much better than that. And a deck like Giratina, that's live for so long in comparison to any other deck, especially because, like I was mentioning earlier, a lot of time you do want to Abyss Seeking early because the deck has slower starts. I think people write the deck off for that. They say it's like, oh, it's just a pile, it's too inconsistent, it's too clunky. But the deck really can come back from huge prize deficits. A lot of the time, going for an Abyss Seeking to guarantee more cards in the Lost Zone when you're having sort of a slower start can be a really safe play to activate Roxanne earlier. That way, because your opponent's usually going to go, their first prize is going to be like a Comfey. You can go for an Abyss Seeking if you have a bad start, and then your opponent goes down to 3, and now Roxanne's live for the rest of the game, and that rest of the game might be pretty long once you factor in all of your disruption cards and the attacks that your opponent might miss, or knockouts your opponent isn't going to take because of your bulkiness. So Giratina really is, more than any other deck, about playing the long game, right? You are trying to bait your opponent into Roxanne on the turns that you want to Roxanne them, or into Counter Catcher on the turns that you want to Counter Catcher them. Trying to strategically give up prize cards with things like Abyss Seeking, or having like an uninvolved Giratina be on the bench with an energy on it. There's a lot of situations where you can bait your opponent into bossing instead of Ionoing because you want to keep your hand, and then you get to do something like Roxanne Counter Catcher Path on the next turn and take a big knockout and have like this huge swing turn. Which honestly, when you do something like go like Star Requiem, like Counter Catcher Path, Roxanne, Star Requiem, a lot of the time that can just take 6 prize cards, because your opponent has 2 cards, can't use rule box but 1 abilities, and you just knocked out the biggest threat on their field. A lot of time, that's enough to just win the game on the spot. You know, those 2 cards, or +1 for turn, or +1 for the next couple turns, isn't going to be enough to get them into a better position, especially against something like Gardevoir, which might just not find a path out. Miraidon, which might, not find enough energy to get on board. Same with like Baxcalibur. If they don't find a Pokestop, it's really, really tough for them to not get a Giratina. And then from there, you can just boss their Baxcalibur or counter catcher their Baxcalibur, no matter how far you are behind. Against something like Roaring Moon, they might not find the resources to power up another Roaring Moon. So there's just a lot of ways that play can, take that play can win you from any prize deficit. Obviously, you'd rather be keeping pace a little bit more than that, but if worst case scenario you have to, Roxanne Counter Catcher Path Star Requiem is like one of the most powerful plays that any deck in the game can do right now. And we can see on Play Limitless, like Giratina does have, of the decks with like high meta shares, the highest win rate right now, and I think that's why it's very well positioned. It doesn't have really any bad matchups, and it realistically can come back in any game, no matter how, like, even if you had like a terrible start. Obviously, eventually you have to draw something, you have to get into the game, but overall, the deck has like more comeback potential than anything else in the format, and I think that's like super valuable right now. Especially because all the new decks are like pretty weak to disruption, especially like Iron Valiant and Baxcalibur hands. Like, they really don't deal with Path to the Peak well. They don't deal with Roxanne well. Roaring Moon is a little bit more equipped to deal with it, but against Roaring Moon, you have all these one prize Pokemon. If they use Roaring Moon to auto KO a Giratina, then you're just easily KOing them with Sableye and probably taking a 3-prize turn with the Sableye. So you really do have just like a solid game plan against everything. You have solid options against everything. The things I'm sort of considering still are, most of us are only playing 2 counter catcher. I really like 3 because I think that a lot of games you will want to use 2, or maybe you just want to burn 1 early because you're having a slower start and you want to try to buy yourself some extra time by making it a little bit harder for your opponent to get the cards they need by bringing up a Pokemon they don't want in the active. So I like having that extra counter catcher, but I could also see that being a Pokegear that have a stronger late game and a stronger early game, just for digging out Colress early and Roxanne later, or having more outs to find boss, or even just another copy of boss itself. Another Super Rod might help sort of smooth things out. I found the energy line plus 2 Super Rod to be relatively consistent, as long as you manage your resources correctly. But of course, you'll always have those outlier games where you had to Colress or Flower Selecting 1 too many energy, and it would be sort of nice to have that 3rd Super Rod. But I find 2 Super Rod is usually pretty generous to you as long as you manage your energy correctly. For me, the 3rd counter catcher feels very strong for now. I think that it's definitely the most cuttable card in the list. If you want to add something else, if you want to add a 3rd Water or 3rd Super Rod or a 2nd boss, that would be, or a Pokegear, I think that would be the best cut most likely. But give it a list to try yourself. See how you feel about it. If you're preparing for Brazil or even just upcoming like League Cups and League Challenges in the Paradox Rift format, or even events after Brazil, Giratina is not going anywhere. I think it's still going to continue to be a powerful deck throughout the format. So if you have any Paradox Rift events coming up, maybe you're playing in San Antonio Regionals, I would definitely give this list a try, especially if you're comfortable with Lost Box decks or you've played Giratina before. Of course, it is a pretty high skill floor and high skill ceiling deck to play, but I think that it's relatively accessible. You just need to practice with it a lot. So try the list out if you're a fan of Giratina, and make your own changes. I think there's definitely room for refinement in the list. I think maybe there is a couple cards that could be changed. Maybe you don't need a 3rd Nest Ball, maybe you don't need a 3rd Counter Catcher, maybe the switching cards could be switched around a little bit. But the Pokemon line I'm pretty set on. Maybe you want a Spiritomb in here for the Mew matchup, and a Lugia matchup. I think that there's definitely some room for experimentation, but overall I'm pretty happy with this list, and I think it's like very consistent. It's just sort of always usually does what it's supposed to do, and you're always able to find those late game disruption cards to get you back in the game if you have a slow start, which I think is very important in a deck like this, which is sort of notorious for having awkward opening hands, or you go a few turns without finding Colress and you fall behind. It's important to have consistent access to those late game comeback options. So I hope you enjoyed. If leave your thoughts on the list below if you have any other suggestions, or if you have been liking Giratina for the Paradox Rift format, or if I want to know if people have been liking Lost Box. I actually think Lost Box, whether it be Turbo or Radiant Charizard, are like very underrated right now. People are dropping them because of Iron Hands and Jirachi, but I think that both decks are still relatively well positioned. As if you play, especially Radiant Charizard has been seeing quite a bit of success online, and Turbo Lost Box has been hasn't been doing super well online, but I think if you can find a consistent way to deal with Iron Hands, not a lot of people are playing Jirachi, so I think the deck is still pretty strong. So leave in the comments your thoughts on Giratina, and if you're liking any other Lost Box decks, and have a good one.